Time for markets now, and Dr. Scott Brown is our analyst this week. He's the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the University of Missouri's College of Agriculture, Food, and Natural Resources. And there's lots of uncertainty in the cattle markets right now, and Scott is here to fill us in on what we know. Scott, thanks for being here today.
You bet, Troy.
And we're going to start off by talking about the coronavirus outbreak, and cattle producers want to know what impact this is going to have on beef demand. And perhaps one thing we're seeing is a change in wholesale beef prices and choice boxed beef cutout values. Is this a reflection of the uncertainty in the market?
You know, Troy, I think there's a combination of things going on when you look at the choice box beef price. We've been running $15 to $20 a hundred below year-ago levels so far this year. And I think part of that could certainly be a demand story that we're talking about. But I like to remind us that we shouldn't forget that cattle weights are up. We're producing more beef. If you look year-to-date, beef production's up 6%. So I say it's more than just demand. And in fact, when we start thinking about coronavirus and the issues, to me, we haven't seen a real income hit yet. We've seen the stock market be ultra volatile of late. But in terms of less money in the pockets, I think that's yet to play out. I think those that are suggesting weaker demand because of a slowdown in the economy, if that slowdown in the economy occurs, that will be a correct assessment. But we're way too early to really get a true sense of what the demand drag could be, both domestically and internationally.
So in terms of export demand, is it one of those things where you see beef impacted here, or is it harder to tell when you combine it with issues that we already have, like ASF or the new trade agreements, or what's going on with the stock market? Any insight on that?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the export side, you backed me up prior to coronavirus. It was all about, we got USMCA to the finish line, we got a US-Japan agreement completed, and a phase one China deal. All of those had to be a lift to exports. You add ASF into that mix as well, and I go Chinese consumers looking for all of the alternatives, protein sources that they can find. It seemed to me that was all going to be good for the beef side. And then all of a sudden, coronavirus slowed all that down. You look at the monthly trade data we got out for January, and it's all still positive now. Much of that was pre any real serious coronavirus issues. But it just reminds me that cuts in tariffs that we see in agreements that we got with Japan, all that to me certainly set us up for greater exports going forward. With ports shut down in China, I think that's been, or not operating at full capacity, that's been one of the downsides. But figuring out where all of this ends up in terms of global economic downturn, it probably creates a situation where we're going to be a little less positive about trade out of the United States in meat products this year.
Sure. And cattle futures taking a hit as well. Do you have any update there?
Yeah, I sure wish I would have known in early January to tell folks to lock in prices. Hindsight being 2020, we've seen a $20 decline in fed cattle prices, 15 or so in feeder cattle futures as well. I think it has, again, a lot to do with the uncertainty in markets, but I remind us supply side has been important in this as well, and I think sometimes we've missed that piece of the story, that weights are higher and we're producing more beef tonnage than we did a year ago. But I think these futures markets are going to continue to be bearish until we learn more, which is likely weeks in front of us, about ultimately what the coronavirus does in the United States.
And then also we've got the monthly cattle on feed report coming out next week. Anything we need to be watching for here?
Well, so the last thing we need is some negative, more negative on the supply side of more cattle placed on feed than we anticipated. I see some numbers out that suggest to me we've brought a lot of calves out of Mexico in as we've started 2020. I'm really just looking for placement numbers out of this next report and really where we set relative to a year ago. We started the year with fewer cattle and calves in inventories for the first time in quite a while. It's just going to take us a while for that to translate through to ultimately less feeder cattle supplies coming to feed yards. But we need less supplies just given what's happening on the demand side. So we'll pay attention to that cattle on feed report for that kind of what are we going to get here 6 months down the road in terms of fed cattle ready slaughter numbers?
Sure, and it seems like the key word right now is uncertainty, so maybe this final question is fairly important today. Any other marketing or risk management tips that you want to leave us with?
Yeah, so I'd sure tell folks to be careful today with how they manage risk management. And I say that from the standpoint of, I don't want to get one side locked in, and I say one side. I don't want to necessarily get that output price locked in without thinking about what I'm doing on the input side, because I think we got volatility happening in all these ag markets. So I wouldn't want to leave feed unhedged, if you will, and only have cattle hedged. You got to think about how that whole mix fits, because I don't think we're done. You know, when we look at stock market, that, you know, one day is up significantly and the next day we retrace all of that. Futures markets have been doing the same thing. Yesterday cattle futures were up pretty strong, today not so much. I just want folks to realize, think about the whole suite of risk management that you want to do. Will say there's risk still both ways. Even though we've seen futures markets that have been moving lower for cattle here since the start of the year, I don't think we want to close by saying couldn't be more downside risk in those markets. Knowing what your cost of production is in terms of using cattle futures, I think is important. You sure don't want to lock in a loss at this point, but I might like to let some others have some risk if I can lock in some reasonable returns. Tough to do today, but if these markets were to rally, we'd want to think about how to take advantage of that.
All right, all good things to keep in mind. Dr. Scott Brown with the University of Missouri, we appreciate it, and good talking to you today.
Troy, thanks a lot.